Good evening, my friends. Are you here for another spooky story? Then come on in. Settle in now, for tonight I have quite the tale to tell. Are you ready? Good. Then let us begin. Tonight's story is a creepypasta. A short horror story that I hope you will all enjoy. I've thought about doing fictional horror stories more often and maybe posting a few here or there along with my true stories. Anyway, settle in, because short story it may be called, but it's about 20 to 21 pages in length, so this one's a doozy. Now, gather around and listen well to the Authoress consultant. Being an editor can be boring at times. Charlie Carter himself would admit that he and his co-workers used to fight to get a hold of whenever an actual interesting manuscript came through their office, which, admittingly, wasn't often. Carter and a couple of his friends started up the business a few years after college. The little independent publishing house was on the outskirts of a small college town, so they frequently had a steady supply of modest income. Most often, this came in the form of supplementary texts for classes from various professors, who also were often willing to have Charlie's team keen eyes peruse their latest articles and essays that were to be published in this or that journal. In addition, they did a decent business of designing and making copies of flyers and posters for the various extracurricular groups, as well as putting together cookbooks for fundraisers from various churches in the area. You would think at least a peek into the minds of these locals would be interesting, right? But no. When you had to proofread the 15th draft of what was essentially the same geology study of the same local rock formation with minor rewording, you started wanting to pull your hair out. Charlie already knew all of the local deaconesses' recipes by heart, too. At least he could get a good chuckle out of the rare fantasy or romance novel, even if nearly every one was a thinly veiled fan fiction drummed up by some bored housewife or high school kid. Thankfully, for the past few years, Charlie himself was in charge of what was essentially the real bread and butter of the business. The one and only Miss Sheila Reed. Now there was an author. He didn't know how the woman did it, but the way she could lay words upon a page made him feel like he was right in the middle of her latest crime drama. Everything she wrote was so visceral, so incredibly real, that Charlie found himself engrossed every time he picked up one of her works. Oftentimes, he would find himself unable to tear his eyes away from the page until some outside force intervened. How many times had she come in, smiling softly, and handed him a packet, only for the yells of his co-workers leaving for the day to jar him back to reality, making him finally notice that the bright sunny day outside of his window had been exchanged for the void of night. It wasn't just Charlie that was enthralled either. From her first attempt at the genre, Miss Reed's novels sold like wildfire. The nation couldn't get enough of her works. In fact, they had gotten so big that Charlie had to hire extra staff around the time she turned in a new novel just to be able to handle the demand. Hundreds of publishing companies, some even international, had begged Miss Reed to let them be the publisher of her next book, but she always declined. Her loyalty remained with good old Charlie Carter. It made the 3 years of perusing her painful old attempts at literature finally worth it. Charlie could scarcely believe that this was the same mousy receptionist that he would hand back manuscripts so covered in red ink corrections that her papers practically bled. She tried everything: fantasy, romance, sci-fi, historical fiction. All of it was, to be frank, garbage. Her worlds were superficial and boring. The characters were so two-dimensional that the paper they were written on had more depth. The mock science behind her fictional technology was so bizarre and illogical that she had to butcher even the most basic building blocks of science that they were based upon. As for her romances, well, even the veritable fanfics the high schoolers tried to pass off as original prose were less awkward, and most of those made him wish that brain bleach existed after he skimmed over them. That was overlooking all of the grammar, spelling, and general syntax mistakes that flooded her manuscripts. In all fairness, Charlie should have told her to just give up, the way the other editors in his company would have. But Charlie knew what it was to have a dream, and he wanted others to live their dreams too, if at all possible. Besides, Miss Reed really did try to take his advice, and even though he was sure she was scrimping at times, she was willing to pay the fees for his consultations. Slowly, her syntax and grammar began to improve, as did the depth of her fictional worlds. Her characters began to have some development, and his suggestion to draw ideas from the rest of the world soon began to show up in her works. Unfortunately, a lot of it was still as bland as stereo instructions, so 3 years went on with very little progress. It was so hard for Charlie to see the hopeful look on her face as she shakingly handed over her latest masterpiece, only for it to be slightly less of a literary nightmare than the last. She always tried to hold it together, but there were so many sessions where the shine in her eyes from happiness was replaced by moisture. In the end, even Charlie was convinced that maybe she should find another hobby. But that all changed one winter evening. Just as Charlie was about to close up shop early as a snowstorm started to blow in, he was accosted by the lights of a car peeking through the blinding snow. He wasn't happy to know he was going to have a slow and nerve-wracking drive through the heavy slush, only to have to read her latest drivel. But the woman was so doggedly determined that she was willing to risk coming out in that mess just to turn in something, that he couldn't turn her away. He wasn't surprised that she was nearly out of breath when she got to him. She practically skidded into the general vicinity of a parking space, almost tore the car door open to get out, and slipped and slid as she rushed toward him, shouting his name. He managed to stop her before she fell on the slushy steps, only just barely keeping them both upright from her momentum. As he asked her what the rush was, she pushed a now slightly crumbled manila envelope, obviously thick with papers, into his hands. "Read it," she said, more of a breath than real words. Her eyes, he remembered, looked as though they were nearly about to burst from their sockets, and her chest heaved from lack of oxygen. She wasn't pale, as he would expect someone who had trouble on the snowy roads to be, but flushed. Had she run part of the way there? He asked her just that, but all she could say was, "Read it." Before he could say more, she was back in her car and rolling away, thankfully at a much slower speed. Unsure what the uncharacteristic display of emotion on her face had meant at the time, Charlie just looked at the manuscript and shrugged, before tossing it into the front seat of his SUV and heading home. Oh, if only he had known what was waiting for him inside of that little packet. By the time he reached home, the snowstorm had become a full-blown blizzard, leaving almost the entire town stranded beneath several feet of snow. Unable to go farther than what little shoveling he could do, and no power besides what his backup generator provided, Charlie was stuck. With little else to do, he, in his boredom, decided he may as well get some work done, and started in on what was sure to be Ms. Reed's latest butchering of the literary arts. After his eyes skimmed over the first paragraph, however, he had to do a double take. This wasn't like Miss Reed's writing. This was good. The snowstorm was quickly forgotten as a tale of tragedy and debauchery wove itself before him. For the next several hours, Charlie found himself before his fireplace, his eyes greedily taking in line after line of black text upon soft beige pages. His gaze never straying from the page longer than to throw a bit of kindling upon the fire, or to pat the head of the shaggy mutt that Miss Reed herself had given him upon learning that his last dear canine companion had passed on. Soon, however, he found himself forgetting even those. By the time he finished the story, Charlie realized that the fire had long since gone out, and that he had, at some point, started reading by the light of the morning sun, now unobscured by the billowing snow. With his mind in a whirl over how realistic the crimes had been, and just how unbelievably believable the way the characters thought and reacted was, he was almost certain that Miss Reed had plagiarized the whole thing. There was no way something that good could be her doing. Once he had the internet running again, he scanned the documents into the computer and ran it through some plagiarism sites. Surprisingly, he turned up nothing. He even ran a few pages through a translation application a few times before running them again. And still, he turned up nothing. Maybe it was a local writer's work she stole? Charlie confronted her a few days later. Indeed, the work turned out to be hers. But why is it so different from your usual work? He asked, trying to be polite as possible. You mean, why is it actually good? She said with a chuckle. He tried to speak, but she waved him off. It's fine. I know my past work hasn't been up to par, but I've been practicing and following the advice you've given me. Charlie raised an eyebrow, saying nothing in hopes that might prompt her to say more. It worked. Well, there has been one change. Yes? I seem to have come upon a consultant of sorts, she revealed. A consultant? Oh, yes. Not that he's better than you, mind you, she started, trying not to offend him. Charlie, however, couldn't have been less offended if she had tried. He must be some consultant to make your work so vivid. Thoroughly surprised by how candid that he could be, since this was truly the first positive results he'd ever witnessed from one of her works, Charlie and Miss Reed began making plans to have the work published and distributed. The manuscript was so good that Charlie was willing to call in a few favors with some other colleagues in the business in order to get the book out there, and his efforts were met with unparalleled popularity. That had been 3 years ago. Miss Reed was an internationally acclaimed novelist now, with her face being the poster child for crime dramas everywhere. Every bookstore Charlie ventured into had her books, audiobooks, and the logo Reed's Reads blazoned on merchandise galore. She had been on talk shows and the news, and she had even put their tiny town on the map. Her works were so realistic that a couple of cops Charlie was friends with were a bit suspicious of how some of the more disturbing details of her fictional crimes were hardly something that anyone outside of law enforcement could properly depict. Of course, Miss Reed, or Sheila as he got to call her now, was too sweet of a lady to ever actually know first-hand accounts of some of the more brutal instances in her stories. After seeing how the slightest criticism stung her, even though she patiently kept her composure through each meeting, he also highly doubted she could ever be involved with anybody of the criminal element. Perhaps her consultant was a law enforcement official, or had a background in criminal psychology. Strangely enough, though it had been about 3 years since she started writing crime dramas, no one had a clue about who her mysterious consultant really was. In fact, not even in the 8 months since they began dating did Sheila even once hint about who it might be. Whenever Charlie would ask her, she would just assure him that it was an old friend in the field and left it at that. As time went on, however, the darker her books turned, and Charlie started to become concerned about who this consultant might be. In her first book, the protagonist was a woman who escaped the poorhouse by catching the eye of a rich man. Of course, he became abusive, and the time period would not allow for divorce. Then, through a series of twists and turns, she actually gained her freedom through what seemed like an accidental death of her horrid husband, but was really her own doing. She was well off, but soon found herself pressured back into marriage to a kinder man, but one with a tremendous gambling habit. As he began to run through her inheritance, she wound up doing away with him by convincing another suitor to do away with him. Soon, the woman found herself a widow once more and, corrupted by her distrust in men, became enthralled with causing their deaths. Morbid, Charlie admitted, but the way the woman struggled and overcame domestic abuse and the chains society held on women during the story's setting was almost empowering. In fact, Black Widow's web had been touted as the reason why some women had been able to take that first step to free them after they had read it. Sheila had even donated part of the proceeds from a reprinting to countless women's shelters across the state. Other works were more along the same, portraying good-hearted people down on their luck that had a moral turning point, but even some of the more ghastly crimes could be excused because readers could identify with the protagonist. The farmer's son who left town, returning to buy out the rich banker who ruined his father's life and took their farm. The homeless child turned wise guy turned informant. The indentured servant that became a master thief and con artist, eventually becoming a mistress and settling down in her own household through her biggest scam yet. But then came the stories that were less about vigilante justice and karma, and more about getting into the mind of career criminals. Backcountry drug lords, narcissist mothers with homicidal streaks toward their own flesh and blood, a cannibal and serial rapist out for revenge after years of torture at the hands of his own stepfather. And now, with her latest and touted to be greatest manuscript yet in his hands, Charlie just had to know who was filling his beloved Sheila's heads with these dark and foreboding ideas. So, like the detectives in his girlfriend's books, he hatched a plan to get her out of her house to do a bit of snooping. Even though he was her editor, agent, friend, and now lover, Charlie had never been allowed inside her attic, which had been renovated into a study. The little room where Sheila claimed she did all of her writing was closed to all and sundry, even to him. In fact, she kept the door locked and the key with her around her neck at all times. Of course, he understood why. Sort of. At one point, a reporter had barged into her house and started doing some snooping for clues about her latest manuscript. Sheila, of course, had retreated to her study, which was essentially the highest and safest room in the house before calling the police. Ever since, she told him, she had kept the room locked so she could feel safe in her home. The intrusion had been so traumatizing that she even made Charlie promise she would be allowed to keep her private space before she agreed to date him. At first, Charlie wholeheartedly agreed. But now, he found the curiosity more than he could handle. It's for her sake, really, he told himself as he pulled into the driveway. He knew Sheila would be going out that morning for a dentist appointment, so it would be easy to sneak into the house without her knowing. Before stopping, he picked up a large bouquet of red roses and a card, planning to say he was going to leave them there as a surprise so the neighbors wouldn't get suspicious if they saw him there. Using the key she had granted him only a few weeks before, he undid the lock and slipped inside. Charlie rubbed his arms, the sweat of his palms cooling almost immediately upon entering the house. The little dwelling, despite being plastered with bright floral wallpaper and having fluffy throw blankets draped over this or that chair, always felt so cold. Even in summer, it stayed delightfully cool, so Charlie couldn't imagine how brutal the winter must be. Carefully, he looked about just in case Sheila was still home. He didn't know why, as her car was clearly gone, but perhaps it was the guilt he had at how he would soon be breaking his word. The coast predictably clear, he slowly made his way up the stairs, the hairs on the back of his neck gently lifting as his senses tingled. This wasn't like him, and he knew that. He knew his beloved wasn't capable of doing something so horrible as in the books she wrote, but the last one was just so unnaturally disturbing that it was the one book he had to set aside for a while before his stomach would allow him to finish. The story followed a young man by the name of Tim. To outsiders, Tim had the perfect family. A successful father, a compassionate social butterfly mother, and a nice house to live in and a proper education. At first glance, he had all that a boy could want. But his father was only successful because he worked so often, and his mother's community obligations also left little time for Tim once he was of a certain age. Even though no one in town was foolish enough to bully him to his face, there were always the whispers behind his back because of how jealous they were of his seemingly perfect life. Other kids seemed to be his friends, but upon discovering they only wanted to be around him for his family's status in town and their resources, he found himself feeling even more alone. That was, until he discovered her. She was special. She was different. She would never betray him. All she wanted was to spend time with him. They would while away the hours, just talking and telling stories. As time passed, Tim grew very close to her and finally found himself professing his love. Of course, he knew his parents wouldn't approve. Their families were from different classes, and even though it was a small town, roots ran deep, as did societal roles. His parents were already talking about how such and such's daughter would make a proper wife for him. It would take a miracle for them to be together. The rest of the story was a well-written, gut-wrenching travesty of how one young man drove his family and part of a community into tragedy. Oh, certainly, Tim was able to make people love him. He played upon their desire for his status, and learned how a few sweet words and a sharp-toothed grin could run those around him into whatever trap he set. Like a wolf to sheep, he set upon them, making personal alliances through his family's connections, rising not in business, but through the church. Using information he learned from his impoverished beloved and his own similarly classed companions, most of whom were as free with their words as they would be with their family's money, he learned of the weaknesses of everyone he could. As a seemingly soon-to-be man of the cloth, he became admired by all. Beloved. Trusted. And he milked that trust for all it was worth. His father only had one son, however, and still wanted him to follow in his footsteps. But Tim had no worries about that, for Tim's father's success was purchased at the sweat and blood of others, and not all of that sweat and blood was given willingly. Whispers moved throughout the town. Tim became adored by the community, while his father became despised by it. Public outcry should have been enough to help him and his beloved become man and wife. But his father was proud, stubborn, and desperate. And desperation makes humans do horrible things. The story was so unlike anything that Miss Ree, that Sheila had written before. It turned his stomach to read what had happened after that, and as good as the story was, it was disturbing enough that it didn't seem so much justice as just bitter. maybe it was just a story. Maybe Sheila just wanted to try her hand at a darker story with more shock value. After all, she dabbled in other genres before. Why did it come as such a surprise when she combined horror with crime dramas? Manipulation, abuse of power by authority figures, running ruses, religious hypocrisy, even murder were uncommon to her works. But there was something darker there that Charlie couldn't put his finger on, and it really irked at him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized it had to do with when she handed him each book. The first successful manuscript that she handed over in the blizzard, there was a look of uncontrollable desperation, of awe and almost disbelief in her eyes. The next few times, those feelings had been somewhat there, but they were replaced with renewed hope and joy. Recently, however, the hope had turned into something colder, harder even. Sheila hadn't acted any differently toward him, and he chalked up the display as anxiety from the intruder. He often caught her double-checking her house and car doors to make sure they were locked, since an unlocked door allowed the unethical reporter to barge in to begin with. He had asked her, but she said nothing was wrong. And maybe, deep down, he wondered if he was right for her. After all, he worked with her for 3 years and barely helped her put a dent in her writing mistakes. Who was this guy who somehow helped her not only iron out all of them, but turned the smoothed out parts into something so real he half expected it to be from a real criminal confession? Charlie would be lying to say he wasn't the least bit envious. So, standing at the bottom of the stairs that led up to the renovated attic, Charlie reflected back on it all. Was whatever was in that room really the key to this mysterious consultant? And was everything they had built together really worth this breach of privacy? Charlie pulled the hairpin from his pocket and looked at it. It had fallen from Sheila's hair the last time she was over, and Charlie's dog had found it. He was going to return it, but instead, today, it would have another use. The lock on the door was a simple interior lock, with a keyhole on one side and likely a small knob to turn to lock it from the other side. His older sister had taught him when they were kids that a straightened bobby pin could pick such a lock without doing any damage, so they were always able to sneak into the basement to find their Christmas presents early. Then, like the bride of Bluebeard, Charlie gave in to his curiosity. He wasn't sure what he expected to be on the other side. A Rolodex with a phone number of her consultant. A computer with a messaging app open. A cell phone used just for work. Hell, even a freaking carrier pigeon might have made some sense. Charlie had to use his phone to see into the room because the hallway had no light, and there was no switch nearby. He pulled himself into the room and shined his light around, but there was a bit of a wall that jutted out, so he had to walk around that to get farther into the room. When he rounded the corner, he caught sight of a ceiling fan and a pull chain dangling from it, so he made his way over. The moment the room flooded with light was the moment where Charlie's curiosity turned to utter confusion. There was no computer on the desk, no Rolodex or phone. Instead, surrounded by dozens of tiny candles, was an open notebook and a Ouija board. Well, my friends, what did you think of this story? I apologize I didn't get this out yesterday, but writing and editing it took me longer than I thought it would. I've literally been working on this story from 7 yesterday evening onwards, and it's currently 2 o'clock in the morning right now. So hopefully I'll have this up by 3. Also, sorry if I got tongue-tied on anything. My voice was starting to wear out by the end of it, and I feel all raspy now. I actually had this idea last year and wrote bits and pieces of it on and off since last March, but I never could get it perfect. So when I wound up in the creepypasta fever this evening, I was just like, heck, I'm just gonna type it all out and see if it's good. So here's the finished product. I hope it's all to your liking. Word to the wise. Don't go talking the Ouija boards to get stories out of them. That's a bad idea. So what's your thoughts? Theories? Please leave them in the comments below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification bell. That way you can catch your latest spooky fix the moment it comes out. And check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Phantasmal Poppy. Thank you. Good night. And see you all real soon.